Dr. Rick Strassman, honestly, is a man who I could spend 5 to 10 minutes waxing lyrical about all of the things that he's done in his time as a scientist, as a researcher, as a doctor, as someone who has delved deeply into the connections of the practices that we are all gathering around. So if you're interested in reading more specifics about his work and his authorship, then we have a really wonderful description in the event, Facebook event of that. And also the same thing with Adriana Kertzer, who I now would like to turn over to you to begin. So thank you both.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Benny, for the introduction. Thank you, Julia, for setting up this fantastic event. Thank you to everyone who is here tonight. It's exciting to be at the Jewish Entheogenic Society's first event. The fact that it's digital, the fact that it's virtual, I mean, it's 2020, you get what you get. But it is just so exciting to see how much momentum these conversations about Jewishness and psychedelics, but Jewishness and psychedelics together, how much momentum this conversation seems to have gained since the spring and then during this summer. I think we'll look back at this weird time in our world's history, and this might be a wonderful silver lining that we can walk away from, that these communities started being formed and people started having conversations about what it means to create explicitly Jewish psychedelic experiences and communities. So I am delighted to speak tonight with Dr. Strassman. We had a preparatory call before this event, and I said, Dr. Strassman, I've heard many of your podcasts. I've watched your documentaries. I've read the book. I was like, this is going to be the Jewiest conversation that you will have the ability to have, and kind of let your freak flag, Jewish flag fly in ways that maybe you never could in other podcasts. So there are many of us that are here tonight because the Jewish stuff leads, and there are others that are here tonight because the psychedelic stuff leads. So this conversation will hopefully bridge both of those sides. So without further ado, Dr. Strassman, can we start talking about your explorations in life and your what we could describe return to Judaism as an intellectual and as a personal interest?
Well, I think the context is that I'm a product of the 60s and a conservative Jewish home. I was raised in the San Fernando Valley, was bar mitzvahed at the Valley Jewish Community Center, which is now at .rel. Got a scholarship to Camp Ramah for one summer. Got into Hebrew high school. That was the condition for the scholarship to Ramah, is if I went to Los Angeles Hebrew High. But by that time I was interested in sports and girls, so I lasted about a month at the Hebrew high school. Went to college and discovered, psychedelics and marijuana. Then, veered off into Buddhism for a good 20 to 25 years. And then a combination of circumstances led me back to Judaism. In the meantime, I studied, DMT for 5 years, kind of the culmination of a lifelong goal. It's in other podcasts, people want to talk about the Bible and psychedelics, but not necessarily Judaism and psychedelics. And I've had one intelligent Jewish interviewer who could ask good questions, but he really wasn't Jewish. He was more of a student of the Hebrew Bible. So, this indeed is a unique environment for me to present at. I'm glad, finally, it's about time.
Yeah, it's interesting because in listening to your interviews, it was interesting to see you navigate, as we all do, right, as contemporary Jews, the question about how Jewish identity uh, comes into or shapes or leads to certain professional decisions. And what fascinated me was you were very early in your study of cannabis. You were very early in your study of psychedelics. If I were to ask you a weird question like, is there anything Jewish about that decision? What would you toss back at me?
Um, well, you know, I've always been interested in altered states. I used to pretend I was flying when it was windy in LA. I'd open up my jacket and pretend I was flying. And I had, jumping out of airplane dreams. I'd fall, I'd get back into the plane, I'd fall, get back into the plane. And I loved that feeling. And I started as a chemistry major wanting to make fireworks, because making fireworks and watching them blow up in some ways recreated that feeling. In my Jewish training, or going to Hebrew school, that is, there was one teacher who would make us sit quietly with our eyes closed for 5 minutes before class started. I was maybe 10 years old, 11 years old, and I would peek through my eyes to see what she was doing, and she was just sitting there quietly, very peaceful, with a beatific smile on her face. And I would close my eyes and try and enter into that, but it wasn't that deep, and we never really talked about it. So it may have been that I saw a glimmer of Jewish relevance to that feeling, but it took a long time to discover it. And in the meantime, it was more approximated in my psychedelic experiences and my Buddhist practice.
I'm in the process of rereading the Jew or A Jew and the Lotus, which has been interesting for me to reread, thinking about you and this conversation. And it leads me to ask if in the 60s and 70s, when you started becoming interested in Buddhism, I mean, in a way, given the number of Jews at that time that were interested in Buddhism, did that feel sometimes like you were in a Jewish community exploring Buddhism, or is that wrong of me to kind of characterize?
Um, well, one of the attractions of Zen Buddhism, which was the sect I studied within, is very intellectual. It's very abstract. It's almost Talmudic. Um, there really aren't any images, at least theoretically. It's kind of it's a vast perspective on existence that you really can't point a finger at, but yet the approximations of what you were seeking after was uh, it was possible through koans, through stories, through study, through narratives, through ritual. So I felt some satisfaction, some innate resonance with the practice, but it wasn't that Jewish. More superficially. There was maybe one Jew in the monastery, one Jewish monk, and after a while, he just said, I've just had enough of this. Um, and there's a lot of bowing, a lot of ancestor worship, lots of statues. Um, yeah, so after a while, the Jewish genes in me began to revolt against the form of the practice and the discipline, which, in a combination, with other things, I felt like I had gotten as much out of study and practice of Zen, more or less, by that time, and it was easier to make the exit and return to my Jewish roots.
And speaking about the exit, one of the things that I read, and then you also shared a little bit in our preparatory call, was that it was um, part of the reason for the exit was that you wanted to speak more publicly and study in a more open way the correlation that you saw between psychedelic experiences and decisions by individuals to become Buddhist monks, or Buddhists in general, and that you received significant pushback for wanting to engage in that inquiry. And in our call, you joked that you were just like, I was just too Jewish about it, like that you were asking too many questions and that you just wanted to ask too many questions. So I was wondering if perhaps for the first time in your podcast interview life, you could share with us a little bit more about what this joke of being too Jewish about your DMT and your psychedelics research and being a part of a formal Buddhist community. Like, how did that pan out?
Um, well, it's quite interesting because nearly every monk that I was able to get aside, privately, admitted that they had their first flash of enlightenment or an enlightened state of interacting with the world, from an LSD experience, and that's why they became monks, was to solidify, expand, integrate that initial flash into their lives. So as time went on, they encouraged my work with DMT. They were genuinely curious. But when push came to shove, they didn't really want psychedelics and Buddhism to be associated with each other, especially within a setting, an institutional setting. They would be identified as the monastery that's encouraging people to take LSD and become monks. So they just didn't want to take a public stance other than there's no relationship, forget it. But at the same time, they were saying, let's just keep it private. And I was, rocking the boat because I, was interested in, taking it more public, opening up the dialogue. What is the relationship between a psychedelic experience and Buddhism? So that was, question, like a scientific question. Like as a researcher, you want to do studies, you want to do experiments, you want to be open, present arguments for and against. But I was, told in no uncertain terms, Buddhism is not science; it's a religion, and we've got certain ideas to maintain. So that was as much me being a scientist as being Jewish, but still, I was kind of kicking up dust. The other thing is in Buddhism, there are certain questions which do not conduce to enlightenment, and they should not be asked. But, one of them is there a God? The other is how did the world come about? So those were two questions that were not conducive to enlightenment, and they didn't really lead anywhere. But at the same time, I was curious about those questions. How did the world come about? Why is it this way? If we are bowing to idols, to statues, why can't we bow to God? And why isn't God talked about? So those are more, niggling things in the back of my mind. I never really brought those up within my discussions with the monks, but, especially anywhere, near as saliently as the psychedelic issue.
That's interesting. And this was back in the relationship of 25 years with your Zen Buddhist community, just so we can place it kind of in the map of time. Did that come to an end can you locate that in time and also locate that in terms of what scientific studies you were working on at the time?
Well, I first went to the monastery when I was 22 in 1974. 1974, yeah, and the relationship ended in 1996 when I was 44. So I was 22 in 1974. That's when I first was introduced to the temple, and then things wound, down in 1996. Well, I was 22. I dropped out of medical school. I was really depressed. I was at Albert Einstein College of Medicine of Yeshiva University in the Bronx. There were all these Orthodox Jews all around me, and they gave me the creeps. I didn't know, how to relate to them. It was very a foreign culture for me. I, grew up in LA, the beach, volleyball, Hollywood movies. Everything was, secular. And, to be at Einstein and yeshiva was just kind of mind blowing. And I was a California kid, more or less. So I got depressed. I just couldn't handle it. Dropped out of school and then ended up at the monastery. And I was there for a while, maybe 6 weeks. My depression lifted, finally. And I decided to go back to medical school and stayed in very close touch with them. I was, meditating, hours and hours every day. I, found psychoanalytic psychotherapist. I found a speech therapist. Yes, so it was all hands on deck. I was going to make it through medical school like a champion. Carry water or carry wood, chop wood. That was my approach when I returned to medical school. Just get it done and do it the best you can. So I finished medical school, did a residency at UC Davis, then a fellowship in San Diego, and then moved out to UNM to Albuquerque and did the melatonin work in my 30s, looking at the pineal gland and the role of melatonin in consciousness. And that wasn't very exciting, but I got my chops doing clinical research. And then did the DMT work for 5 years. Moved up to Canada to help my wife with some issues, and then things broke down with the monastery within about a year and a half. So quite a lot happened. I began studying Tanakh though in 97. So I made a pretty quick transition from Dogen, to Maimonides. They lived at the same time too. That's the most amazing thing about Dogen and Maimonides. Dogen is the Japanese person who went to China, to learn Zen, and he came back to Japan and he founded Japanese Zen. And he was just a giant of an intellect. And Maimonides lived around the same time, 1200 to 1260, something like that. So there was obviously something going on in the stars with these two just intellectual giants producing such enduring work.
And your gateway drug, for lack of a better term, back into Jewish studies, what was it? Like I in all the reading that I did about you, I'm craving like a visual. What was it that you saw that kind of brought you back? I think it was a Milton Bonded book, which I was very happy to hear as a Brazilian Jew, that I think it was a Milton Bonded book that spoke to you, and then kind of like you credited with this, for lack of a better term, return.
It was the Kabbalah of Envy, which I just stumbled upon at at a big occult bookstore in Port Townsend, Washington, where I was living and working at the time. I was, separated from my wife. My monastery, my monastic religious community was giving me a hard time, and I was feeling, rather distraught. And walked into this, metaphysical bookstore. Walked up and down the rows. There's all this Hinduism and Buddhism, and I just said, "Oh God, I've had it with these guys." And upstairs there was this, little, Judaism section, and I thought, "Oh, this might be interesting. I'm Jewish." So the cover of the Bonder book is really bright, turquoise, and there's a lot of turquoise in New Mexico. There's a lot of that, color everywhere that you look. The sky, the gates. Yeah, so it's a little book, you know it. Yeah, and I started skimming through it, and I was just blown away. And in particular, what blew me away was the tale of the two farmers. One wanted to, borrow a sickle. One wanted to, borrow a chisel. There's revenge. There's a grudge. It completely scrambled my brain. I didn't understand what was going on and why it was considered to be important. So I mean, it would take me hours to figure out a particular sentence in there that I just couldn't crack, but it felt like it had the same import as my initial discovery of the Buddhist, sutras. It, you know, a written product which stimulated an unusual state of mind. Like, of course, this is exactly how things are. And I felt that way with Bonder's work, but I couldn't articulate it. I couldn't make any, cognitive, sense out of it. So I got through the book and said, well, I need to find his original sources. If I find an interesting, field, I like to go back to the original sources. So, Bonder, got his smicha at the, JTSA. So I got onto their website, started to, follow the weekly Torah portions, then started to, read Tanakh, and moved to Taos a few years later, and was, part of a study group and learned about Art Scroll and Mizora and Judaica Press. And started getting in, to the medieval commentators, which are, critical in any understanding of prophecy.
So I want to transition into a discussion about the book, The Soul of Prophecy, because I know that there are many people that were in the book club here. I know that is how we advertise the event, and so I think that this introduction into your personal journey, and this recent comment about Bonder's book allows me to craft a transition, which is, one of the things that you brought up in the book was this concept of relatedness, and also the idea that this kind of notion of enlightenment, where one disappears, didn't seem to show up as much in your DMT experience, observation. And I guess perhaps you can talk more about that. What is it about relatedness? What is it about Newton Bonder's book that kind of highlight maybe what you felt was not clicking, was insufficient, wasn't making sense in the ways that you were previously analyzing entheogenic experiences and spirituality in general?
Well, let's return to that tale of the farmers arguing over the chisel and the sickle. It turned out to be a very fine-grained analysis of human interactions, psychological fine-grained analysis of what people are like, and how they relate to each other, and how things can go south if you're really not clear, transparent, open, seeking peace as your primary motivation. So it was a way of spiritualizing the ordinary, which I had never really considered before. It was a bottom-up approach to spirituality. If you can really grok on the fine-grained analysis of human interactions, then you can start expanding your view of who your relationships are with, or what you're relating to all of the time at all of these different levels, as opposed to the top down model of spirituality, especially if it's a unitive, ego dissolving, mystical experience with no content, no verbal content, no cognitive associations. You develop the perspective on analyzing interactions from the top down. If the fundamental quantity is zero, if it's completely empty, sunyata, if it's this empty vast void, then you come down and you make it up in a way as you go along. You can add your own personality to it, your own presuppositions. So I think it's more prone to abuse, can be anyway. The bottom-up approach, it's kind of like, don't put the cart before the horse. Don't start, talking about merging with the one before you've worked out your relationships with your neighbor. And it's only through working out with your relationships with your neighbor that you're prepared to, take the higher steps upward, towards the divine.
And it's interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it also, the fact that we have 613 mitzvot to contend with, and we can talk about, separately what our relationship as contemporary, maybe secular Jews are with those mitzvot. I mean, I think that it's the perfect example of what you're talking about, right? We come from a tradition that is worried about, giving your planting land a break, and that break has to work a certain way. You eat things a certain way. You don't eat certain things a certain time. Your clothing has a certain, makeup of this and not of that. And I think that it's interesting that you talk about that bottom up approach, because I think one of the things that we can walk away from this talk is thinking about, what does that mean also in terms of cultural priming for psychedelic experiences. So I think that if you could talk a little bit more about, after everything that you've experienced personally and then also administered in terms of testing, what does it mean to have Jewish preparation for a psychedelic experience, and the cultural priming that leads up to an experience, and then the integration after that experience? Because I think if there's one thing that probably unifies all of us at the Jewish Entheogenic Society is this question, right? Like, how do we make this this experience more Jewish, and what does that look like?
Well, before we dive into that, there are mitzvot which are behavioral or interpersonal and emotional, like the golden rule. There are a few verses in Leviticus where the golden rule appears. Don't seek revenge, don't bear a grudge in your heart, reprove your fellow, don't bear a sin because of him, love your fellow as yourself. I mean, those are, really profound interpersonal guidelines, the proper way, to relate to each other, which are, then I think, reflected in the more agricultural and, specific, more specific mitzvot that, that you act on, but the interpersonal ones are also, laid out. Cultural priming, how do you get ready? Well, it's a question that I seem to be being asked, more the last few months is, how do you have a more spiritual, psychedelic experience? And, my answer just kind of popped out the first time I was asked. And I just said, well, be a more spiritual person in the first place. And then your trips will be more spiritual, because that's the material, the psychic material that you're working with, or that the drug is acting on. So the drug only acts on what's already there. You're not going to learn to speak Portuguese if you've never heard it. You're not going to become a classical piano player if you've never played the piano. So you're not going to be a more spiritual person if those notions are foreign to you. and the more that they are part of who you are, that gives the drug experience, as it were, more material to work on, to amplify, to clarify, to cement, to give new insights regarding. That's the more generic response. To a Jewish group, I mean, one of the beauties of the Bible is that it's a prophetic text. It's an account of prophetic experience. It's narratives, narrated from a prophetic point of view, and there's a lot of guidelines about being able to get the most out of your experience. Zechariah, for example, is confronted with these visions that he just doesn't understand, and there's an angel next to him, and he says to the angel, what are these? And the angel says, don't you know? And Zechariah says, no. And tell me. So the angel then explains, and you can use that kind of methodology, I think, when you're interacting with psychedelic experience. You can use the tools that are articulated in the prophetic text to optimize your relationship to the psychedelic experience, because they do resemble each other in many ways. Joshua, when he was confronted with the angel holding the sword as they're about to enter Canaan, in his dream or his vision, he asks the angel, "Are you with us or against us?" So if there's an angelic being or a demonic being that you encounter in your psychedelic state, you could ask, "Are you for me or are you against me? Are you good? Are you bad?" All the different names of God, you can recognize different aspects of the divinity by understanding and being able to pull from the attributes of God, which are represented by his different names. Jeremiah starts his interactions with God with a prayer. Like he prays to God before the vision begins. Solomon's dedication of the temple, it's all praise and thanks. So if you want to get closer to God, you can do certain things. You can pray, you can thank, you can petition. So all of those are tools that you could bring to the psychedelic experience. Then during the trip itself, you could steer things in a Jewish way. For example, in the mystical unitive model, you're told to let go, to accept, to open, but that may not be the only option for how to deal with a tight spot in a psychedelic state. It might be better to argue. Look at Abraham.
And
Sodom.
say that, right? Like to tell a bunch of Jews who are going to go on a psychedelic experience, just accept it. I just think that sounds completely culturally inappropriate. So please, I just had to laugh at that, because that image just popped in my head, and it just is like an exercise in defeat from the beginning.
I know it just kind of goes against, it goes against a fundamental personality trait. Depending on the dose you take and your intent in tripping within a Jewish context, you could take smaller doses and pray or study. You could even look at Ezekiel's first chapter on a low dose of a psychedelic, or a higher one if you're really brave, and try to reconstruct the chariot. That isn't an unheard of idea. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it for a novice. It would be like entering Pardes. I mean, it would be pretty dangerous, but it's conceivable that you could visualize things in the text much more readily under the influence if it's a lower dose and you're able to kind of maneuver. So dosing is important, and integration, just, well, the simplest idea regarding integration is to occupy yourself with things that remind you of the best part of your psychedelic experience. So if you felt a certain way when you're tripping, and you feel a certain way, doing something else in your everyday life, study, a relationship, a job, an artistic endeavor, then focus on that. You want to be true to yourself. You don't want that experience to go to waste. You want to continue developing it.
Do you feel like a lot of the conversations and the way that studies have been formatted until now potentially clash with a more Jewish approach? Do you think that there is a vocabulary, if we can allow ourselves to be postmodern for a second, is the discourse of current psychedelic study one that is culturally weighted more a certain way versus another way, so that if those of us who want to create Jewish psychedelic experiences, we should just be aware of that existing, I don't want to use the word bias, but that existing tilt in some of the existing, game plans kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge issue. The approach has been a universalistic approach because the belief in clinical research is that humans are humans across the board. There are some ethnic and some racial things, but if you listen to people give lectures about the mystical experience as curative in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, all of them will say, there's a mystical experience at the basis of all human religions. So that's part of the theology is it's a universal experience, universally accessible, and because of that, it's not particular. There's a real emphasis on a lack of particularism. So I've kind of labeled that approach the psychedelic religion of mystical consciousness. And the handbook, the guide, the textbook, the foundational text is a book, by the main therapist at Ahmed Hopkins, Bill Richards, and he wrote a book a few years ago called Sacred Knowledge, and he's very anti-prophecy, anti-Judaism, anti-text, anti-Hebrew Bible, because it's too particularistic. It's too specific. It can't be pigeonholed in a universalistic approach. The approach that he takes, philosophically, theologically, it's Vedanta, Vivekananda, Henry James, the humanistic, psychology movement, New Age, kind of, we're all one. We're being influenced. And evangelical Christianity. He thinks that the more people trip, the more likely it'll be of the second coming. So it's a quite non-Jewish. It's very unkosher. But at the same time, the technique is quite helpful. It's been a very effective treatment for all kinds of problems. So the underlying theology is weird. But the technique is quite useful. It's a very effective therapeutic model. But still, if you're a Jew wanting a Jewish experience, you're not going to find it in the vast majority or any psychedelic research that's going on now. I think it would need to be kind of off-grid, as it were. It wouldn't be within the mainstream of the research community, just because it's too specific. Because when you start looking at the content of the Hebrew Bible, then people start flipping out. One God, God's involvement with history, the Jews' connection to the land, circumcision, I mean, all that is just too much. It can't really be part of scientific discourse. So it needs to be, taken out of scientific discourse.
And is there a rabbi or a set of rabbis that you have been inspired by in your studies and that you would put on our radars as we think about creating these Jewish psychedelic experiences?
Oh boy. My first reaction is not really. The people I refer to are all the medievalists,
And why
Maimonides,
is that?
Ibn Ezra.
Why?
Well, because because of their towering intellects. Ibn Ezra is quite clear about the mystical dimension of understanding the plain meaning of the text. If you can crack the plain meaning, Ibn Ezra believes, you can be transported to some fairly abstract realms. So Maimonides has got that same effect on me too. His talking about the negative attributes. You can't really say God is one, because one, what does that mean, and how do you refer God is one? But you say God is one because you don't say that God is two. So you fine tune what things God is not, and then you become closer to understanding what God is. So that's a very trippy approach to understanding God. So the thing I have found about most of those commentators is you really need to work on separating the wheat from the chaff. But when you do find a kernel, I mean, they're mind-blowing kernels. Like, for example, that idea of Ibn Ezra, that if you understand the plain meaning, you really are onto something. So that's why I like those guys, Nachmanides, Albo. I like Ramchal, Chaim Luzzatto. He's quite good at expanding everyday interactions into the spiritual realms. I think Bonder was really probably inspired by Ramchal. He's more of a Kabbalist, but still, he's Musar Kabbalist. So the Musar people are good, if not a bit tedious. But Musar, I think is a good place to root around too, if you want to integrate your psychedelic experiences and make the most of those trips when you have them. Read Musar together, let's say. Yeah, so
Judaism,
I think, has got this like vast array of tools that could be brought to bear on the psychedelic experience, both for preparation, supervision of the session, integration. In a way, and I don't want people to think I'm weird, but in a way, I think you could speed the coming of the Messiah through this approach.
So that's your evangelical take. That's your competitive evangelical take. But we only have a few minutes left, and I was able to weave in two of the questions that I got from the Q&A overlapped really nicely with things that I was curious about. So I wove them into this chat so far. So I think that we can end this conversation that just feels too brief with me asking you. So let's say we plan this incredible psychedelic retreat, legalities TBD, location TBD, date TBD. What is, and you were to come, right? You were to come, you were to join. What is an activity or something, or big or small, that you would want to see the group at this retreat do, something Jewish that you think would either prepare the group before a ceremony, help guide the group during a ceremony or help guide the group integrate after a ceremony? What would be the top item on your Jewish psychedelic wish list?
Well, first of all, I mean, I just wouldn't feel that comfortable doing it. I mean, I'd be a participant and chime in, but, that almost, seems like the role of a rabbi. And I'm not rabbinically trained. But still, I'm a psychiatrist and I've studied the text, so I could contribute, to the extent that I'm qualified. What would be the preparation? Yeah, I mean, study, pray, set your intent, and bring to bear as much of your Jewish soul to those things as you can. And afterwards, I mean, I just can't really visualize it other than the group, talking, and I would just, pitch in to contribute, whatever I could. The question would be, would I participate? Would I, trip with the group? I would have to think about that. It wouldn't be an automatic yes or a no. It would be a complicated decision.
You have plenty of time to think about it. Keep us keep us in suspense. Right. Don't say yes to the party yet. I mean, obviously we don't even know, when we're going to be hanging out in person, but thank you so much. Is there, before I bid you farewell, is there anything that you would like to say to all of us, as a way of closing out this chat?
Well, if you want to be in contact, if you want to, be in touch, drop me a note. My email is rjstrassman@gmail. My website is pretty up to date, has my email address on it. So I'd like to carry on the conversation. I think it's long overdue. And I think it could be really valuable to both the Jews and the rest of the world.
Excellent. Well, may this be the first of many conversations. Everyone that's here, please check out Dr. Strassman's website. You can then see all of the books that he's written. There is one that I'm dying to read next, Joseph Levy, and just dive into more of his incredible background and his hardcore scientific research. So thank you very, very much to everyone for being here tonight and for this very exciting opportunity to moderate the Jewish Entheogenic Society's first event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone too. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Toda Rabba Rav Todot to everyone for attending, to Dr. Strassman and to Adriana for having this really fruitful and dense conversation that I'm sure people now and later on will watch the recording of, and there's so much to mull over and to consider. So thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. And we have some time now to sort of merge into some free-form schmoozing time. So if you have to leave us for something else, then we say thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your attention and for your commitment to helping us create this community during this time where we're trying to bridge those distances and to create connection around ideas that we really believe, as Dr. Strassman so eloquently said at the end, could really be a benefit to our community, our people, and also to the entire world. So if you have to leave, thank you for being here. If you don't have to leave, please stay, hang out, schmooze. We'd love to get to know everyone who's in here more and just build more connections between each other. And also just a big shout out and thank you to Julia for doing all the work in the background, doing the breakout rooms.
Thanks, Julia.
And just everything. So thank you so much for all your hard work putting this together. We really all appreciate it. And so that's sort of the end of our formal gathering. That's the end of the formal gathering. But I'm curious to hear, not just from Dr. Strassman, and if you want to speak to this, you can, but to anyone else in the room who feels confident enough or comfortable enough to speak to all of us about it, your perspective. Picking up on something that Dr. Strassman was talking about a little bit before, relating to this sort of the divergence between unitive versus sort of I-thou experiences, and how maybe in the hierarchy of sort of the Bill Richards Huxleyan approach and this perennial philosophy approach, that somehow unitive mystical melding experiences get sort of placed ahead of the I-thou experiences. I'm sort of wondering from anyone who wants to speak to it, if that relational approach to mystical insight, that relational approach to spiritual deepening, is something that we might be able to build programming around. That something that is hard to create programming for is inducing mystical unitive experiences, but maybe in the process of getting into the nitty-gritty of relationship building, is there some opportunity there for any of us who are so inclined to start to imagine creating opportunities to make intimate connections with one another, you know, through the modality of entheogenic experiences that sort of like illuminate how important that I-thou experience is in the Jewish context. So I'm just curious if anyone has any opinions about that. Dr. Strassman, you're included in that.
I'll say something about that. I would just say that, like, a lot of when you talk about, like, really when people come to psychedelics for healing, what they're really trying to do is, like, you know, correct or rectify a relationship of self to environment or self to community. So anytime you're having a ayahuasca experience and you see Mother Ayahuasca and she comes to you and she begins to kind of break out to you these fractured areas of your life or these behavior patterns that you're continually caught in, like, that's the I-thou experience. That's a guide showing you yourself, reflecting back to you these patterns that you have and allowing you to make that self-corrective, you know, assessment, or you have these openings that then allow you to kind of turn the faceted diamond of your life and begin to experience yourself and others in your life as something new. So there's a regenerativeness there that you're not going to get if you just kind of blast into a million particles and merge into nothingness.
Right, which is like Michael Pollan talked about that when he did 5-MeO DMT. He sort of just like got on this rocket ship and just was like, there was nothing, and then he was just so grateful that there was something, and maybe that was the takeaway from that experience. But, you know, as you just said, for so many people who are engaging with DMT and the form of ayahuasca specifically, that is this constant relational aspect that you just can't get away from, and yet somehow in the Richards, James, you know, Huxley approach, it's like it's not legit unless you meld into nothingness, or like meld into light or something. Which is so fascinating because it doesn't necessarily reflect the reliability and the sort of the repeatability of that relational part of the experience. So I'm so interested to know why it doesn't get as much credit as it could from the thinkers who are writing.
I think, yeah, I think it's because of Christianity, you know, supersessionism. You know, if you read, you know, Richard's book, he, you know, talks about the prophetic experience, an interactive relational one, as the foothills, and the mystical experience is the mountaintop. You know, so it's, you know, clearly a statement of the superiority or the inferiority of the Jewish model, the Jewish spiritual experience. It's too material, it's too earthy. So it's, in a way, the same Christian anti-Judaism trope. If it's just too specific, it's not ethereal enough. So I think it's just another iteration of, you know, Jews are you know, hidebound by the law.
So
For me, it often really feels a lot like a one-upsmanship too. It's kind of that ultimate spiritual bypass. It's like, how many drugs have you taken? How many times did you kind of break through to this thing? Oh, there's an ego attachment there that is kind of like a notching of the belt approach that kind of like, that creates this hierarchy that is, it's almost like the exact distraction of what you should be doing, which is really that deep precision. You know, psychedelics can be like a scalpel of your own relationality to self and other.
I want to share something that came up in our group when we were talking about the dynamic between spiritual experience and entheogenic use, which is like even the aftermath of a unitive experience is one of recognizing relationality, right? That if we're all one, so then that has huge impacts for, okay, now how do we come down off the mountain? How do we integrate what we saw into our daily life? And all of us were talking about how that leads to spiritual practice, or doesn't always lead to spiritual practice, but spiritual practice can be the then container that helps to revision what that looks like in terms of an ethic, in terms of actually being with other people. I think I'm freezing, so I'll stop here.
That's so it reminds me of this image of someone coming back from a journey, and they've got their knapsack, but the container, like the actual sack itself, is kind of deteriorating the further away you get from the experience. And so there needs to be something that helps us to reinforce and sort of give structure and solidity to that pack of things that we bring back with us, so that by the time we turn around, it's not all just been like left in a trail behind us that we can't recover.
And what's often essential to that is having community that you do spiritual practice with. Not just doing it on your own, but actually having Sangha or some kind of group that helps you to continue.
Well, and that also brings up the question of group experiences versus, like say the therapeutic model where it's, you know, a patient. And then, I mean, you could have multiple patients who have all partaken in the same therapy and come together, you know, as a group, you know, to integrate, or you can have the group experiences, or you can have both, you know, as just different, you know, possibly like, you know, maybe a higher dose, like, you know, alone, you know, with an eye mask on, or however it's done, you know, and then, you know, coming together as a group and participating in a, you know, a group session, and having those different modalities and having those different means of experiences, and then of course coming together as a community to process and to integrate and to incorporate it into our lives.
Totally.
Well, it's interesting that one of the words that is trending in a lot of this kind of mindfulness talk world that we live in is container. And to bring it back to the 613 mitzvot, and to bring it back to like a Jewish reality, if we were to do like an event, Benny had a great comment that he made this week in a conversation with him. He's like, let's just make a Shabbaton. And it's interesting, right, that in our tradition, you could basically lay out an experience and take advantage of that format that is already in our tradition, perhaps as a starting point, right? Don't reinvent the wheel. As an event planner kind of brain, don't start from scratch. Say, okay, what do we have in this experience, you know, and in this tradition that we can draw on, both for, you know, as we design a group psychedelic experience, right? So borrow from nigunim, borrow from rules that apply to Shabbat, borrow the tradition of wearing white, borrow the tradition of shutting off digital devices. You know, I'm just kind of throwing it out there, but it's interesting that the term container is trending, and we come from a tradition that is very good at architecture and at creating containers of time and containers of thought.
Yeah, for
Yes.
anyone who's following on the Jewish Entheogenic page, there's a whole thread that's kind of had a lot of traffic lately, and it's about like the Jewish calendar and how you can kind of like use that momentum of the Jewish calendar to kind of enhance and kind of, you know, like do that preparatory work for your next experience.
Yeah, I'm currently working with a text that I found from the organization Psychedelics Today, who created an integration workbook that has a 7-week model. So it's essentially an Omer model. Like you could really take the model that they use and just slap it on to, like, you know, between Pesach and Shavuot. And like, clearly I don't think the authors who created it were thinking about it, but it highlighted to me already just there's already so much untapped ritual, spiritual potential in the structures that make up the fabric of the annual cycle that could be investigated by any of us, really, to try to benefit people having experiences within the context already of, as Adriana said, the architecture of Jewish time.
It's like, you want a dieta? Let me tell you about Passover.
I've always seen one of the I guess, rituals that is, I don't know, ripe for entheogenic integration as tashlik. Personally, my experiences, my first experience with mushrooms was I had been reading a lot about the therapeutic practices, and I went into it with the question, what am I doing wrong in life? And it really did feel like this casting away. And I think, you know, having the metaphorical, you know, going to an ocean or to a river and, you know, like literally casting those things away as a part of the practice. And then of course you have the integration period, you know, with the high holidays and everything. And it just almost seems like, you know, you have you have Rosh Hashanah to prepare you, and you have Yom Kippur to, you know, to really settle and integrate, you know, all the experiences. But I don't know, for me, that's just you know, just a thought that I've been sort of meditating on.
I mean, to pick up on like all of that, that everybody was saying, which is brilliant, and I completely agree with. So like, I even just saw specifically with the context of like the pandemic, like Shabbat becoming like a thing in like non-Jewish circles. It's like understanding that like, yeah, like we are really dependent on technology and infrastructure and all these other things to survive, especially now, but also all the more reason now, like we need to, you know, like look back to see, you know, see within our own tradition, or within other people's traditions, if you float that way, and that's totally cool. Like, where is there wisdom that we could use to, like, you know, bring relevance to our times? And I think specifically, as everybody's been saying, is that entheogens, for a people who generally are more spiritually, I think, disconnected than maybe some elements of, you know, prior generations have been. We haven't had as much time to like focus in and dedicate like this. We, you know, need, a lot of us, you know, would highly benefit from this tool to be able to like facilitate that practice. So like I, you know, work in research, and I've seen that, you know, just like from my own like literature reviews, there's like on my own personal experiences, is that like noticing the ability to start a mindfulness practice like after an entheogenic experience was like highly beneficial. Like it was like, it's much more malleable and much more like formative for me in the context of like that, you know, having had that powerful experience, as opposed to just like waking up and saying, I'm gonna be more spiritually connected or more grounded just out of the blue one day. So I think like the idea of looking back into these, you know, it's like looking into this like more contemporary science and seeing how that can be used to catalyze our more traditional wisdom that we maybe haven't been able to relate to in the past is something that is like continuing to like show its like support and evidence, and it's really great to see.
Totally. Yeah, I'm thinking about the tashlik things though, because it's like, yeah, and then like the roots of the ritual of tashlik are so mysterious. It's like, where did it come from? Like, why? Like, when you think about the tradition as old as ours, like why do we do all of the things that we do? And like, the answer to some of them is like, we don't really know. Like, we abide in the mystery of the longevity of the tradition and its ability to absorb and contain things that it picks up through the millennia that can serve us, that can open us up, that can help us dive deeper. Yeah, and so I love that Tashlik sky is really sticking in my head right now, just because it is a very poignant, almost emotional experience. You know, even non-entheogenically speaking, you know, it really serves as like a touchstone of that whole period of time that people gravitate to with their kids, you know, across the spectrum of observance and ages. It's really something that sticks out for people. It's something that's worth doing, even if they don't necessarily know why do we do it, what's the origin of it, what are like the minutia of the stipulations of doing it versus, you know, but people don't really concern themselves with that. It becomes part of something that they relate to. And I think, you know, if there's more things like that already that we can identify, that, you know, broad swaths of Jewish communities from multiple, you know, denominational settings could relate to and connect to, I think that's fertile ground to be working with.
Well, you know, Tashlich in a way is an iteration of the goat for Azazel. It, you know, bears away our sins. You know, keeps us from being punished. Kind of cleans the slate for the year.
Yeah, totally.
And there's a lot in the structure of a Seder too. So if we're talking about integration, And I've never thought about this until now, because the tashlich is almost like this purifying, but I'm also thinking about, in terms of integration, what could be a ritual that's open-ended enough, formatted enough, and repeatable, right? So there's something to be said about the format of a Seder that it's almost like snowflakes, right? Like no two Seders are ever the same. And so many different traditions have created different Haggadot. And yet maybe that's also something for us to think about, right? Like what would a Seder at the end of a group experience contain? And I'm saying this because Eitan's mention was so interesting about weaving a mindfulness practice into one's life after certain experiences. So I wonder which big mindfulness experiences we can weave, and small that are Jewish.
Thinking about mindfulness, I just want to mention something that, like, I'm sure a lot of us already know, but so many of the proponents of Western mindfulness that went out to study Theravada and Buddhism were not only trippers, but they were also Jews. Mm-hmm. and you know, I'm thinking of like Joseph Goldstein and Sharon, you know, and like not just him, but there's a whole class of people who are now considered sort of like the paragons of teaching mindfulness in the West, especially in the United States. And they share two things that we're talking about right now, both in their experience with entheogenic experiences and also their experiences with Judaism, or their lack of experience with Judaism. And something that was calling them to that part of the world was the fact that their Judaism, as it was being presented to them, was not offering like that sort of deeply satisfying, filled out spiritual sustenance at a time where you had all these people coming from another part of the world showing a different way of being and of operating, and not necessarily seeing that reflected in the tradition, you know, that they were inheriting. And so going out and trying to find something else. And I just want to make that point that, like, the you know, as someone who studied a lot of sort of the history of contemplative neuroscience, and thinking about how many of the researchers and the thinkers and the writers are all Jews who have tripped, like, it sort of makes me chuckle to think we're now in this like sort of mindfulness moment in the zeitgeist, and how Jews and entheogens both play a very fundamental role in that process.
Yeah, I think there's a reason like why we end up doing so. I mean, I think there's generally been in a lot of like Western and like Ashkenazi, like mainstream Jewish practice, like a lack of spirituality that a lot of people have noticed. And there's obviously been like within the Jewish structure, like developments as a response to that. But I think a lot of people, understandably so, looked towards Buddhism or psychedelics to find what we were lacking there, especially after like our horrible trauma of like what happened, you know, whether it's before the Holocaust or like, you know, the European Jews all left for some reason. And, you know, I think they had this, like, you know, we talked about like kind of cultural consciousness, or like the collective consciousness, and one of my breakout groups is like, we've had this collective, you know, trauma, and Jews of all sorts have that as well. But even, you know, especially, you know, obviously there's like the more you know, traditional closed off like sects of Judaism, but like, you know, you have a wide array of people who are, let's say, strongly traditional but in the secular society, and are being exposed to all these different spiritual type practices. So like I think it's fascinating as well, and I also like I think it makes sense. I think now we have this potential to like see what, obviously we're, you know, with the science, with something, you know, especially like from my Jewish background, which is like modern Orthodox, you know, we could look at like tradition and science, and we could say we have this scientific advancement that is showing efficacy, it's showing true tremendous value to people, be very healing. How can we, you know, grapple with this issue, think about how it works with, you know, within our own, you know, context, it's comfortable for us. And I think it's pretty clear, like based on the evidence thus far, and all of, you know, as you said, the, you know, historical, you know, Jewish progenitors of this, you know, movement, that there is something there, like with us in it. So I hope to see it continue.
What about like the historical use? I mean, something that's coming up for me is when you look at like someone like Stan Grof's work, where it's like, okay, we were doing psychedelic research, it got all chopped on the block, and then we moved to this holotropic breathwork model. And something that I've kind of started to see emerging in my Jewish, communities and inroads is this idea of like, if you go to like Yom Kippur and you're kind of doing this long day fasting and this, chanting, that there's some kind of transcendental quality that emerges there. That's almost like an analog to what would be a psychedelic experience.
I think the mistake would be for us to, let's say, think that psychedelics are the only answer. It's that, for some people, this is a path towards, connection and self-transcendence. Other people will connect through a prayer practice. Other people will connect through a meditation practice. There's 613 commandments, not because we all will deeply connect to every single one of them. We may want to, but some of us will succeed at others more so than others. And breath work, I think it has a role. I mentioned like in the breakout session, William James as like an intellectual kind of like influence of mine. And he would talk about mystical experience and the varieties of them as having different presentations, but ultimately coming to this same, realization at the end of these same universal values. And I think that is what we should be emphasizing or thinking about, as opposed to, let's say, evangelizing, no, you need to do psychedelics to connect to God, otherwise you don't know anything about God. And I definitely see that from sectors of the community, and hope that at least within our context, we could have that more holistic model, including the breath work and the meditation and, dance, yoga, whatever it is that works for someone.
Dr. Strassman, have you ever spent time in a sensory deprivation tank?
No, I haven't. Joe Rogan talks about them all the time.
He does, doesn't he?
I know of a couple in Albuquerque that run a flotation tank. They've invited me out there, but no. Well, there are a lot of technologies out there, but I think it's also important to not forget that mindfulness is a practice that emerges from Buddhism. And Buddhism has a certain worldview, a certain theology. For example, the thing you interact with in mindfulness is your mind and your body. And that's really not a Jewish practice, at least from the biblical point of view. It's an engagement with something other than God or each other. So I think it's important. I'm all for efficacy. I'm all for people feeling better and doing better. But if it's going to remain Jewish and not universalistic, like a Vedanta, all is one, everything comes from the same basic experience, we'll need to differentiate between what's Jewish and what's not. If they mix together, fine. If some people don't want them to, or it isn't as simple. I mean, I don't think as laying mindfulness over a Jewish scene because of the Buddhist origins of mindfulness, which is different than Judaism. And Buddhism and Judaism are very different religions.
Yes.
Their worldviews are very different. Their theologies.
Can I ask, since you mentioned Joe Rogan and he's kind of become like the cultural spokesperson for DMT, do you have any laments about the facilitation of that from your documentary or your work with them? Or are you guys good friends?
Yeah, Joe and I know each other, a number of years ago. We drank coffee at Starbucks on Ventura Boulevard in Sherman Oaks. He was uncomfortable with a hug. It was funny. I wanted to hug him goodbye, and he was a little nervous about it. This was this was a long time ago. So Joe's great. Joe as the narrator of the documentary. Well, it was a joint decision. Mitch Schultz, the producer, and I thought, who's got the widest following out there, and who's most keen on DMT? How do we get the word out to the most possible people? So, you know, um, Joe Rogan, the color man for UFC, Fear Factor. He's got a huge following of people who otherwise would never consider thinking about psychedelics. So um, you know, I think it was an effective decision, an effective choice. It kind of catches people off guard when when they see Joe as the narrator, but yeah, I think overall it worked quite well.
I wanted to just offer one other framework, because when we talk about mindfulness and Judaism, just getting back to that for a second, I absolutely agree, Dr. Strassman. I also was a Buddhist practitioner for many years before I became a rabbi, and still do like to do Buddhist practice, because the Jewish meditation retreats are not as quiet as the Buddhist meditation retreats. But just to offer this, that the theme of blessing, how we started this whole thing tonight, both the ritual technology of saying blessings before we do mitzvot, I see that as a strong mindfulness type of practice for taking a moment to be in the body and recognize what we're about to do. It's a very different thing than just focusing on the breath, but that feels important, as well as the idea of being a channel for blessing into this world, as well as the way that blessing is something that passes from generation to generation, keeps us connected to our ancestors. I just want to throw that out there as a meme of topic that is one that's really close to my heart. I've done a lot of work on it, and it feels really relevant for one of those key pieces to kind of hook around.
I think that kava na and mindfulness share a lot of features. There's a lot of overlap, but they do come from different systems, and they're demonstrating overlap. Doesn't mean they're the same thing. Although I think that's fine. You use what works. So. It's a complicated issue, especially with the infusion of Buddhism and mindfulness into the society. It's like huge. It's almost driving on a lot of things that otherwise wouldn't be taking place. So I'm not saying it's good, bad, indifferent, but it's good to keep in mind that there are different phenomena.
Is there someone maybe who hasn't had a chance to ask a question or to speak publicly that would like to kind of come forward and allow us to hear their voices? Anne, you want to say something? We'd love to hear from you. David, you guys want to say something to us? Hi. Julie, you want to come on and say something with us?
Oh, one comment I'd like to make is I still meditate. I mean, I still do Zazen every night. If I'm stuck at a traffic light, I still do Zazen. I started reading Dogen's instruction to the chief cook a few days ago, which is a completely important Buddhist text. So I haven't disavowed parts of Buddhism that I have found useful even 25 years after ending my formal affiliation with the community.
I am going to speak because it feels like we should, because it's lovely to be here. I'm David, this is Faggy, we're in New Jersey. So yeah, I used to be a Buddhist, and then I was a Jew-boo, and now, thank God, I'm a Jew. There's a wee bit of meditation every now and again. And yeah, I'm really, I guess, blown away by the possibility of the soul experiencing these journeys through psychedelic molecules and plants, finding kind of dveikus and connection, cleaving, kind of rejoicing with Hashem, and what that means for I guess, the manifestation of our ancestors and of the essence of the Torah and the light of Hashem kind of flowing through, just being alive in momentary consciousness. And I don't know much about DMT. I haven't read your book, unfortunately. I've never had DMT yet. Bezrat Hashem, the time will come. But yeah, I'm really interested from what I've read about DMT in particular, as the kind of spirit molecule and particularly the Jewish concept of neshama. I guess the cleaving to Hashem and the revelation of the kind of divinity within us. And then as an aside, I'm also interested from what I've read about DMT with these kind of other realms, and from knowing a wee bit about Tibetan Buddhism, these kind of other realms and kind of universes. Kind of what does that mean from that point? Perhaps from a Jewish perspective of, you're looking at kind of Tzimtzum and Sephirot and the different kind of levels of universes from Asiya to Atzilut. Kind of truly, what is our essence and what realms are we able to connect with? And these are just questions that I'm hopefully going to find out some of the experiences and more questions too as time comes by. So I'd love to hear what you might think, Dr. Strassman, and others about these things I don't know enough about yet.
Well, toward the end of the DMT and Prophetic States book, I reformulate Maimonides' view of prophecy, how prophecy works, it's a pretty simple model, and the way DMT plays a role, or could play a role, is by enhancing the imagination. It provides more raw material for us to apprehend. It makes us more receptive, or it can make us more receptive to previously invisible information and forces. It's up to the intellect to get the information from those images in the imagination, but you can start the beginning of any spiritual experience, or the container for all the non-abstract elements of any spiritual experience begin being displayed on the imagination, the visions and the voices. And if you have more visions and voices, the information that they contain come from someplace, either from yourself or from God or some combination thereof. So that's kind of the starting point. And then when you have a framework, an intellectual framework, you can then interact with the contents of the imagination. You can get as much information possible, from those contents. So DMT isn't inherently spiritual, but I think it can make you more receptive to spiritual levels of reality. Or it might not. I mean, that's where peer review comes into place, and false prophecy and things like that. But ideally, that's the combination. You stimulate your imagination from divine overflow, and then you try to make sense. Like Zechariah. What are these things?
Julie, did you want to come forward and speak with us?
I would, yes. Hi, thank you. I want to thank everyone for all the discussion and wonderfulness that's gone on here. I just wanted to say, it's really lovely to have a place where I can come and hear and discuss information coming from my traditional and ethnic roots, right, and my religious roots, because there's a lot in the psychedelic community. It's a lot about a lot of different other cultures. And I struggle to find my place with that. And I really am excited to do the exploration of what that looks like within my own cultural context and my own religious and spiritual context. That just it feels like coming home, and it just feels so good to me. And so I really look forward to that, the exploration, the discussion, and the community around this. So thank you.
Yosef, we haven't heard from you. Did you want to speak?
I don't have too much to say, but I did, while Dr. Strassman was talking, I remember something he said just spurred a thought that I'd never had before. That I remember when I was back in the 80s, going through cable, there were premium channels that you couldn't get. They were there, you know, there's a little fuzzy thing, maybe a little bit of dialogue, and you turn on the premium channels and suddenly you can see all the stuff that you didn't before. When he's talking about DMT just a minute ago, it reminded me of that. You know, it's turning on the channels that that you're wired for, but not tuned into yet.
Anna, I wanted to give you another opportunity. Do you want to come on and just say hi, or?
Hi, I'm Anne. I'm just very interested in learning about the integration piece. To me, the psychedelic experience just seems separate from being Jewish. So I'm just interested to learn more about how you integrate the psychedelic experience into being Jewish. So that's why I'm here.
Yeah, well, you know, that's obviously key. You know, what is it going to be specifically Jewish about your integration? I think it's going to depend on your personality to a large extent. You know, for me, when I started reading the Bible, when I started study, I was reminded of certain aspects of the psychedelic experience. And I thought, oh, wow, this is amazing. I mean, I want to just dig into the text. I want to understand everything I can about the text. You know, so for me, it was, you know, textual study. You know, for other people, it could be Jewish prayer, you know, Jewish ritual, you know, any number of things. But I think it probably depends on your personality to a large extent as much as anything. What feels right within a Jewish container.
Something that's interesting to me is, I think when you look at people, you know, after bar mitzvah, people go to college, they kind of fall into a more secular, more worldly kind of focus of their life. And at the same time that people might go through a divorce or a death of a family member and they find themselves in need of therapy, that's also the same time that they're finding themselves back into the Jewish practice. And like those two parallel things, like what in your life, what is that moment that brings you to your knees? And when you're in that place of loss and crisis and devastation, like what is that tether that brings you from that darkness back into connection with yourself, with community, with Hashem?
I also think when I personally think about like what about the psychedelic experience can be seen as Jewish, like once we're integrating, I really think I really think that's something that Judaism, and Adriana talked about this before, but something that Judaism does so well, and Heschel talks about this too, is that we know how to make a period of time just feel so different from the rest of our time. And that's just what we do it well. We do it with the Chagim, we do it with Shabbat, we do it with life cycle events, bar mitzvahs and weddings and funerals. And we really take so much care that certain periods of time that we experience in life should feel markedly different and somehow elevated than other points in life, when we're in the marketplace, when we're going through the banalities and sort of like doing the laundry, which can also be infused with meaning and spirituality. But you know, the Jewish tradition is so littered with beautiful sections of time that take on an added significance. And it seems as though the psychedelic experience, for lack of a better conception, really infuses everything with a sense of significance. That really, and Dr. Strassman could maybe speak much better than I to this, but it seems as though when some of the mechanistic components to these experiences, which allow for a satiation of maybe certain dopamine, serotonin imbalances, which might create some kind of perpetual itch for more, for something different, for something better. But that's that deep satisfaction that people often talk about, that sort of being cradled in a bed of feathers type of feeling, is sort of creates a sense of elevated time, elevated experience that can be also experienced in the bosom of Jewish community in a special time of the year. So I think there's a lot of connection there that I personally see, even if maybe the ornaments of psychedelic experiences don't directly map onto the ornaments of Jewish cultural and religious life.
And also to piggyback on that, I think we also have a tradition of contemporary reinterpretation. So for example, right, the mikvah and the feminist and sometimes kind of supra-gender twists that have been, you know, added to the mikvah are a great example. So how was something that was perceived in a certain way and experienced in a certain way by certain communities you know, how has that been reinterpreted, and with ceremony around it? I think that's also something that I'm going to look at, and kind of that kind of ritual reinterpretation. And also the fact that Pesach became a table-bound, home-bound ceremony once the temple was destroyed. I think we also have that tradition of thinking, how are we going to create a ritual around this moment, and a comfort with that ritual then becoming so heterogeneous and interpreted so differently by so many different people. So in my mind, I see a future in which there will be different Jewish entheogenic experiences, just like you have different Jewish summer camps, and some are Orthodox and some are co-ed and some are this and some are that, because the reality is, as Dr. Strassman said very well, it's some of it is going to be our personality. Different people are going to have different levels of Jewish learning. Someone is going to be turned off by all the Hebrew. Someone is going to need all the Hebrew. So I think that we can almost dare to imagine a world in which literally there isn't just one Jewish entheogenic society, because you're going to have, you know, Joe who had a Reform bar mitzvah, and, you know, Sarah who was raised Hasidic, and they're going to need different things. So I think it's interesting for us to dare to envision a very heterogeneous Jewish entheogenic world that is no different than how we treat mikvah, which is no different than how we treat Passover.
Nice.
You know, the interaction of the psychedelic experience with, you know, time is very interesting. You know, Stan Grof has, you know, said, you know, that the primary influence, the most important determinant of a psychedelic trip in his experience is astrological. It's the arrangement of the stars relative to somebody's, you know, birth time and birthplace. And he's studied a lot with Rick Tarnas, who's this, you know, super mega astrologer, historian type. And Stan and Rick investigated all of these psychedelic experiences, and they decided it was your horoscope that made the most you know, difference in it, the quality and the nature of your psychedelic trip. And it's interesting, you know, the Jewish relationship to astrology. You know, Ibn Ezra was a professional astrologer. He made his living reading charts and, you know, giving advice, astrological advice. You know, so even though, you know, it's proscribed in the Torah, you can still, you know, see, you know, hints of astrological influence in the Torah. And, you know, the practitioners, even the most sophisticated ones, lend credence to the relevance of astrological factors. You know, the space issue is important too. You know, is there going to be well, if you start to build psychedelic Jewish retreat centers, you know, what is the temple going to look like? Are you going to build it like the tabernacle, like the temple? Is it just going to be a big square building? You know, so that's going to be an interesting conversation. And, you know, the different, you know, kinds of, you know, Jewish, you know, psychedelic, you know, practice. Yeah, I think it'll just, you know, differ. You know, it certainly is not going to be uniform.
It'll be like the joke of
the
deserted island with 3 synagogues, right? What is it? Moshe and Shlomo. An
Right.
alien lands on an island. Moshe goes, "This is my synagogue." That is Shlomo's synagogue. And that 3rd synagogue, I will never set my foot inside. We have that to look forward to.
Yeah, what do we say? 2 Jews, 3 opinions?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Speaking
Well,
of which,
But it has to start somewhere. You know, it's got to start somewhere.
Yosef, go for it.
yeah, just real quick thing to throw in. I've studied Hasidus for a number of years, and I feel like that's kind of the bridge between the unitive and personal experience. They all make sense. It's that's what you were talking about made less sense to me. I didn't see it as much, I guess, but they both fit, and they can both happen at the same time under that. It's Tanya and you know, Baal Shem Tov, and it's an, I don't know. I've had some thoughts on it. I may share later, but it seems to be a dimension that's worth looking into. Reb Zalman came from a Hasidic background, and It started basically the renewal movement after LSD experiences and such.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Everyone, speaking of time, we have reached beyond the scope of our scheduled time to be together. So, of course, if you have the opportunity to stay and continue schmoozing and connecting, please do so. And I just want to encourage everyone to continue these conversations also in the Jewish Entheogenic Society page, where we can start incorporating other voices who weren't here tonight. And as Dr. Strassman says, you can reach out to him and sort of ping him if you have other questions that sort of came as a result of this event. And we just want to say one more final thank you to everyone for attending, everyone for bringing such great kavanah, such great focus, and such great curiosity and openness to coming together and building this community and this container. So thank you, Dr. Strassman, for your time. I really appreciate your perspective and all the work you've done over the last number of decades. That's really laid a really beautiful foundation for us to hopefully carry forward as we create the future together.